Today we will cover the topics of environment and conflict as they pertain to migration. We will be hearing from Coco Warner, Brian Schaff, Howard Edelman, and Anna Krogert. I was particularly interested in bringing the environmental component into this conference. And I wanted to suggest to the teachers in the room that don't typically bring in environmental studies into their world studies classes or history classes or English classes that I think this is a really important opportunity to do so, to be talking to your students about the fact that the world doesn't just fit within borders of English class, history class, so on and so forth, but rather that it's important that they see how all of these pieces fit together. And in particular, as we see changes in the environment with increasing flooding and droughts, severe droughts, this is causing countries to literally have to think about relocating populations, relocating communities. And I think that fits perfectly into many of your classes when they're thinking about borders and boundaries and this discussion between governments of who's going to be allowing people to move in when it is an environmental factor. Where is that aid going? Because as we started to hear yesterday, and I think we'll hear more tomorrow, a lot of the aid that countries receive goes into other areas rather than infrastructure, right? So they're not building stronger houses that resist these changes in the environment, but a lot of times it's going to repay debts or, it's going into other areas. So having said that, what are we doing what's going on in the world to help think about where these people are needing to move because of environmental changes? So I think our first two presentations today will be not only talking about the US response, but in general around the world. Oops. Again, the University of Chicago International and Area Study Centers, we are committed to assisting educators in internationalizing their curricula through lectures, workshops, institutes, cultural events, and resources, as you have heard. The Center for International Studies is also a partner institution of the Chicago Cultural Alliance. And I wanted to mention that not only because we have representatives from some of the Chicago ethnic museums with us at this conference, as well as, Yao, if you want to just wave your hand. And remind me your exact title. Is it program? What's your exact title with the Chicago Cultural Alliance? Okay. So as a community coordinator, Yao might be someone that you would like to speak with. This is another idea. I mean, not all of us can send our students abroad. Not all of us as teachers can go abroad to help internationalize our curricula. But by visiting these ethnic museums around the city, and I mean, we have so many. The Chicago Cultural Alliance alone is partnered with 28 ethnic museums. This is a way to utilize the resources from those museums. And I point to the website at the bottom there, where we have actually, so I volunteer to chair their education committee for the Chicago Cultural Alliance, and we've actually developed two matrices that show you which museums around the city of Chicago offer programming in which areas. So whether it's environment or it's cultural events, and which museums are willing to come to your schools for free to talk about different issues, which museums offer visits, school visits to them. Some of them bring people to do a short little language lesson or to do a short music lesson based on that culture. So it's just another way to internationalize your curricula. And I'm happy to talk to anyone if they're interested in working with CCA, and I think Yao is willing to speak to anyone as well. I want to remind everyone that you do need to sign in and sign out if you would like CPDUs. If you want the lane credit, of course, you need to attend all 3 days and sign in and sign out each day. Gregory Smith, who is still with us in the back of the room there, is the person to ask if you have questions on lane credit. If you have questions on the CPDUs and the CPDU sheets, that would be me. So we will collect your CPDU evaluation and your sign-in sheet, the activity sheet, tomorrow at the end of the day. A reminder that if you do the lane credit, that lesson plan is due email to me by July 18th. And to assist anyone in developing curricula, we have, of course, the Institute videos and resources that will be posted. The videos will be posted hopefully approximately a month after the Institute is over. The resources are there now. So thank you all for your evaluations after day one, for those of you who are here. I did notice quite a few comments that people wish that the presenters were providing resources. I just want to remind you that I will use the word nag. I nagged the speakers to get us those resources pretty far in advance. So please, please take advantage of those because they know that they're there for you. So that's why they weren't bringing lots of pieces of paper to hand out to everyone. And we're hoping that you're utilizing those resources that are on the website. I mean, some of those articles really changed my perspective on these topics, and I hope that you take advantage of those. The PowerPoints from yesterday are already all posted, and we will be posting the PowerPoints from today as well before the end of the day. It will be right next to the, so you saw Xochitl Abada's presentation, right under her name, it says her name and it says PPT. So yeah, they're right there. And of course we have the additional links and then the K through 12 lesson plans. So in addition to the resources that the speakers provided, if you don't have time to be developing your own lessons, your own curricula, I am working with the two teachers that are in the back over there. So I'm working with Jeff and Lauren to develop lesson plans. So by the end of July, you'll have even more resources to use with your students if you would like to. And those will be posted under the K through 12 lesson plans. Okay, so day 2, environment and conflict. I would like to now introduce our first speaker of the morning. Dr. Coco Warner is the head of the Environmental Migration, Social Vulnerability, and Adaptation section at United Nations University's Institute of Environment and Human Security based in Bonn, Germany. She researches risk management strategies of the poor in adapting to changing environmental and climatic conditions, particularly environmentally induced migration and social vulnerability. Dr. Warner is a lead author of the chapter on adaptation in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 5th assessment report. She is also the founder and executive board member of Munich Climate Insurance Initiative. She studied development and environmental economics at George Washington University and the University of Vienna, where she received her PhD in economics. Dr. Warner will also be speaking on the panel following the climate change film screening tomorrow evening. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Coco Warner.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Coco Warner. Thanks, Jamie, for the nice introduction. I am from the United States, and so it's really wonderful to be home. I do work in Bonn, Germany, and I'd like to share with you today some perspectives from research which we've been gathering in the past few years. So I'm from the United Nations University. The United Nations does have a university, and I'm part of it. And the unique perspective that we share as a United Nations organization is we look out over the countries of the world, and it's also our job as a university to bring some of those things that we're researching both to United Nations decision makers as well as decision makers in the United States. We're in Washington, D.C. almost all of the time, maybe twice a year, talking to decision makers there and to decision makers all over the world. What I'd like to do with you today is point out a gap which you as teachers have a critical role in filling. You're the heroes of my story, and you face a very daunting challenge. The gap is, we know that the environment is changing. Part of it is due to people, part of it is due to nature, and part of it is due to people. The people part is where climate change comes in. And I'd like to talk to you about the gap between where we are today and where we might be when your students are getting towards the mature period of their lives and when you're probably retiring. So this is in our lifespans, and there's a lot of work to do. So I'd like to point out the gap and give you a few ideas about what you could do with your students to help provide them leadership, and especially to motivate them to talk to their leaders, because there's no one like youth to speak with legitimacy and power about their futures. And the topic that we have today about climate change and its impacts on human society is all about our future. So what we see here is a map of some of the case studies that we've done, and this map now has grown. The areas that you see here in red are places where we've done case studies. So back in 2009, we completed 23 case studies worldwide, and since that time we've added on about a dozen additional case studies. Most of our case studies are in developing countries, so the South. But there are a lot of interactions with countries in the North, like the United States. I'm going to tell you a few stories from people who are from some of these areas where we've done our studies. Now, to get started, environmentally induced migration. Pretty interesting. We know the environment is changing. We know that people are affected. We think migration is part of the story. Sometimes, as I say, I live in Europe, and we have the Mediterranean, which separates Europe from Africa. And all of the time when you're sitting down at breakfast and you open the newspaper in the morning, all of the time you'll see stories about migrants who are trying to come from northern Africa to Europe. And the recent political developments in northern Africa have played a really big role. Most of these people are coming for the promise of a better life, like most migrants all over the world. But increasingly, there's also these kind of anecdotal evidence that things aren't very good where they are at home, that they're having a hard time with jobs. And when you ask them, well, what do? They say, well, I'm a farmer, I'm a herder, I'm a fisherman, and the rains are changing, or think that we can't make a living anymore with the environmental conditions. So they try and make it across. Many of them drowned. Many of them make it to a small island off the coast of Italy called Lampedusa, and they wait, and they wait, and they wait for their chance at a better life. So what we see today, and this is again the gap, if you can imagine a line stretching from that wall to that wall, over here we have today. So I'll walk over here. And I'll try and talk loudly and with the air conditioners going. But over here we have today, 2011. So I am one migrant, and I want a better life. And you might know migrants, you might know people who are refugees who have been displaced because of war and other kinds of conflicts. And here we stand today. And most of the migrants that we talk to go to a different country and then they come back, and they might not even go to a country. They might just, in their own country, they may just go to the city and try and get a job and send money back to mom and grandma and dad and their brothers and sisters and cousins. So what we see today is one person, me. And I'm a migrant. And I go a little ways away and I try and work, or I try and make a better life. And most of the time, those migrants send money back home. And they try and come back home. And you'll see later, I'll present a story. Most of the migrants that we've talked to who have moved for environmental reasons tell us, well, I'm not from here. I want to go home. That's where I'm from. So I may migrate, but I definitely want to go home. Now we're understanding on a timeline is in about 15 to 20 years from now. So we're looking out into the future. And it didn't take too much time. I invite 3 or 4 of you to come up to the stage and stand by me. We're the migrants of the future. If you fast forward to 2020, 2030, the world's climate has changed by about 2 degrees Celsius, or I think that's 4 or 5 degrees Fahrenheit. So we might be taking off our sweaters, or we might be putting them on. Most of the time, people think, 2 or 3 degrees, no big deal. But it will be a big deal. 2 to 3 degrees Celsius could mean big, big changes for our world systems. And so what we see in terms of migration is that it wouldn't just be me, but several of you standing with me, and maybe we've migrated from our country, maybe we've gone to the next best livable place, but there are more of us. And the question is, can we go back home? Everybody's going to want to go back home. If I asked every one of you, where are you from, then you think of who you are and who your neighbors were and what it looked like. Maybe you're from a mountainous area like me, I'm from Utah, or maybe you're from the plains and you think of that beautiful wave of grass, and your identity is tied up in the that too? That's a question. And now, if our journey goes out to the future, even farther, to where your students are 60 and 70 years old, out to 2050, when almost 9 billion or 10 billion people will be living on the planet, what will things look like then? Lots of changes will have happened by that time. Climate change will be one of them. Increasingly, people will live in cities. Today, over half of the world's population lives in cities. Can you maybe not hear me? Should I stand? Ah, yes, I should. It's for you. I'm sorry. So the farther you go here, the bigger questions come up. If we do have the kind of climate change that 97% of climate scientists believe will happen, towards the end of this century, the 21st century, when all of us will be dead, we could have 1 to 2 meter sea level rises. And I'll show you a couple of maps soon about what that could look like. But that brings some questions about our coastal cities and about the world's deltas, which are very densely populated. And that raises some questions out towards this side of our time scale about population shifts and movements. And all of this is tied up today in the talk. Now, bringing us back to today, as scientists, we have a really exciting task, and for you as teachers, also exciting, a little frustrating, but we have some definition and data issues. First of all, there's no definition of environmentally induced migration. In this first bullet point, I list some of the terms: refugee, migrant, displacee, forced migrant, fleeant. Fleeant is my favorite. I think we're getting quite creative. Emergency migrant, survival migrant, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of times, going back to the newspaper, when you read the newspaper, sometimes you'll hear the term climate refugee. And we have a filmmaker here today, Michael Nash, who's going to show you his film tomorrow night with that title, Climate Refugee. Now, this word works really well for us as normal people. And it works great for kids because they know a refugee is someone who needs help right away. And most of us have heard that the climate is changing, or we know what the climate kind of is. So climate refugee, somebody who needs help right away, and then the climate's playing some role. But in legal terms, it doesn't work at all. Why? Because in legal terms, refugee already has a legally specific meaning. It's all tied up in the 1951 Geneva Convention, which was created to protect people who have been persecuted by other people. And the thing about the Geneva Convention is that countries have committed to spend money to help those people who qualify as refugees. And they get to seek asylum in safe places and safe countries. So if you broaden out that definition to include people who have been victims of nature, it starts raising questions for a lot of countries. Oh, do I have to pay for that? Am I responsible? And countries don't like to pay public money to big kind of unbounded problems. So climate refugee is a bit of a problem when it comes to who's going to take responsibility. We have a working term, and I've said that before, environmentally induced migrant. It's very unsexy and it's kind of uninteresting, but it's a working term that means environmental change and people who have to move. And there are lots of different kinds of movement. And you might, if you explore this with your students, you might explore that spectrum. There are voluntary migrants, like me over here on this side of the room, where you're looking for a better life and you choose to go out and try and find that better life. They're forced migrants. People often, because of humanitarian crises and disasters, have to flee for their lives. And they often need humanitarian assistance. There are refugees who have been persecuted, and on and on. So there's really a spectrum. In spite of all of this, we only still have a general understanding of how environment affects human movement. So, guiding questions. This might be something that you could do with your students if you wanted to start exploring the impacts of climate change and what that might mean for human society. Well, we have some definitions and data issues. On the data, how many will move? Who's likely to move? Is it me? Is it you? Is it our neighbor to the south? What does a climate-induced migrant look like, and what do they need? Are they like us, or do they have different needs? How many people will move? When will they move? Is it tomorrow, or is it in 5 years? So those are things that you might talk with your students about. Drivers. We know that migration happens for a number of reasons. Economic and social are the biggest. But increasingly, that environmental variable is growing. And for you biology teachers or natural science teachers, this is a really interesting thing to talk about. What happens if your independent variable grows in significance? What happens if environmental change really becomes a big deal in the future? And we don't know. Climate scientists think that big changes are coming. But there is still some uncertainty. But let's just pretend, what if the environment really changed? What would that mean for human society, our dependent variable? And then policy responses. Who's responsible? Is it the mayor? Is it your senator? Is it the President of the United States? Is it the international community? How do they work together? For those of you who are social science teachers or who do civic studies, that might be an interesting question. If a student or a group of students have an idea, how do they move that through a legislative process? How do they express their ideas and say, this is our future? Please do something about it. How can you as teachers help them decide what are some concrete actions that they can ask decision makers to take? Well, now I'd like to get into some of the substance. So I'd like to tell you about some patterns and share with you some of the stories of migrants who we've talked to. So today, this is a look today. We have seasonal migration. And here in the United States, we're very familiar with seasonal migration, especially from Latin American migrants, who often come from countries like Mexico and other Latin American countries and come and work in cities as well as on our farms. And they come seasonally. And usually, at least before the US borders became so rigid, usually people would go back home. Now it's a political comment and it doesn't have anything to do with what I'm talking about, but now the borders have become very porous and it's difficult for migrants to go back home. So you get a lot of migrants kind of piling up on this side of the border when they might like to go home and visit their families or kind of do what they did there. But we do have seasonal migration all over the world. We also have disasters. This has been a record year in the United States for natural hazards, and you all are much better aware of that. Tornadoes, flooding, all sorts of things going on. People are displaced by disasters. Last year, we had record flooding in Pakistan. Pakistan is an enormous country. It's larger than Texas and part of maybe Oklahoma added on. It's a really big country. Lots and lots of people live there, about 200 million people or more. And about 20% of the country was flooded for a long time. And up to 20 million people were affected by that flooding. Similarly, in Australia, big parts of Queensland were flooded and a lot of people had to leave their homes. So we have displacement. There's also this interesting point about migration and vulnerability. Who's moving? Are they vulnerable? By moving from one situation where they have environmental problems to a new situation, do they become more or less vulnerable? Sometimes in our empirical research, we've gone out and we've been talking to migrants, and 5 or 6 times, it doesn't sound like very much, but 5 or 6 times in different countries, people have told us that as they became migrants, often, I'll share a story of a man from Vietnam where this was the case. He told us, our family had flooding and we couldn't make it. We lost everything, and he had to send his children to work in cities, and he sent his girls to work in brothels. And that's a very typical pattern. It's not very nice to talk about, but it happens all over the world. Vulnerable people go from bad situations to potentially dangerous situations. What can we do about that? Can we help them? Now I'd like to show you 4 or 5 slides of maps and some of the people that we talked to. So what you have here, now we're looking out into the future. We have here a map of Asia. 1 out of 4 people in the world lives on this map. Most populous place in the world, 1 out of 4 people in the world is a farmer, and most of them live here. They get their livelihoods from this area that you can see in white. That is called the third pole, the mighty Himalaya glaciers. They're massive. They feed some of the world's largest, most voluminous, longest rivers in the world. It's massive, it's beautiful, amazing. Now to some of the color schemes. The dark areas, it's actually dark green or blue, if you can see that. It's the world's largest irrigated agricultural system, along these massive river systems. People there get their water, their food, and their jobs from this water system. Now, when global temperatures change, ice melts. Ice is very sensitive, as you know. Water is very sensitive to temperature change. And so today, a lot of scientists are looking at these glacial systems, but also glacial systems in the Andes, where up to 80% of glacial kind of cover is already gone. In the Alps, water security is a major issue in the Alps. The Alps feed most of Europe with their constant water. And in this area here, going back to the Himalayas, we've already noticed rapid melting of glaciers. And what's not clear to scientists, some scientists think that the glaciers are actually shrinking. Every winter they grow again, and then in the summer they shrink a little bit. But what it seems to be the case now is that the glaciers are shrinking faster than they're growing in the winter. And we see that. We see increased flooding in these areas. Lakes build up in the mountains, and then they burst and then flood all of the areas downstream. The question has then, what happens if you get a lot of flooding in the earlier part of our timeline over here, and then later, what if you get less water? What happens to those people and their livelihoods? It's a question. We already know people migrate when their livelihoods are in danger. And what we're not certain about is what would happen here. This is also an area where you have some conflicts. Afghanistan is off to your left. We have a lot of countries that have kind of tense situations, and we don't know what those kinds of big social changes would mean for them. Well, now I'd like to show you 3 stories. This is a rice paddy in Vietnam. In Vietnam, a lot of people make their living by growing rice. This is one of them. His name is Nguyen. We interviewed Nguyen in 2008. He was there in the Mekong Delta, which is in the southern part of the country, and this is what he told us. This, by the way, is one of the gentlemen that I referred to about vulnerability. He had to send his girls upstream to work in a brothel, and we went upstream and found some of these girls and talked to them. He told us, disasters occur so often. Flooding sometimes threatened our lives, and life was miserable. We did not know what else to do other than growing rice and fishing, but we lost everything. These are really poor people. We had to migrate away. My children had to stop school, and I sent my girls to Phnom Penh to work to help our family. Everybody in the family had to go and do something to help the family. Think of your students. What if they didn't get to go to school because of a big natural disaster? That happened in Hurricane Katrina, and of course the government and the communities made every effort to make sure that those children could get to school. But you know what it's like when you're sick for a week and you have to have a substitute teacher. It interrupts the learning of your students. Imagine, what if it was this situation? What if one of your students belonged to this family? Now I'd like to look out into the future. This is the area where we're doing our research. This is the Mekong Delta. Of course, Vietnam it's a really long country, and I'm just showing you here the southern part of the country. But let me tell you about the color schemes on this map. The orange represents population densities. And so here you have 1,000 plus people living in 1 square kilometer, so it's really dense. Most of the people in Vietnam, 95% of Vietnam's rice, fish, fruits and vegetables are grown in the Mekong Delta. It's really fertile, really good soils. It's a delta, of course, but it's very low-lying. Now, the other color of interest to you is the blue and gray. Blue represents a 1-meter sea level rise. So the kinds of sea level rise we might see about 2050. So when your students are around maybe 60 years old, 50 or 60, depending on how old they are. The gray represents 2 meters of sea level rise. Now what you see is that, of course, not the entire delta is covered, but this is salt water. Salt water tends to ruin agricultural land. And you also see kind of islands popping up, but about a third of the Mekong Delta could be inundated by salt water. And it might just be up to people's ankles, but it's salt water. And people have a hard time working with land that's been ruined by salt water. brings some questions about migration. I'd like now to take you to Mexico. We've done a lot of work interviewing migrants in Mexico. This is one of them. His name is Luis Miguel. And Luis told us the following. Let me see if I can get his quote. My grandfather has worked on our lands. Luis lives in the mountains outside of Mexico City. My father, and so do I, but times have changed. The rain is coming later now or not at all, and our crops are declining. The only solution is to go away, at least for a while. And here he and several other migrants told us about their regular patterns of migration to the United States to work on ranches and farms. But then he said, but leave my village forever? No, I was raised here, and here I will stay. People around the world identify with home, like you and I. They want to be at home. They want to go back. That's where their identity is. Now let's take a look at Mexico in the year 2080. Most of us will be gone by that time, and maybe your students will be approaching the very, very ends of their lives. But this is a look at Mexico. Let me tell you about the color schemes. If you can see, there's a gray scale underneath the color. That gray scale represents population densities. And so what you see is that most people in Mexico live in this central part. That's where the mountains are. That's where there's rain. And now I'll tell you about the other color scheme, and that's the brown and orange. That represents changes, projected changes in average annual rainfall. For those of you who have visited Mexico, most of you know most of the country is arid. It's already pretty dry. Now this area that's shaped like Utah, which is my home state, that is a darker brown area. Those areas where it's most densely populated in Mexico, could face a 50% decline in rain. That's also where most people live. And if you look at this little inset map, I'm going to move away from the microphone. So if you look at this little inset map right here, if you see the green, that's in the mountain areas. That's where you can do rain-fed agriculture. Most of the people live in those areas. There aren't massive irrigation schemes, at this point anyway, in the areas where people live. There's a pointer. Let me see if I can do that. Aha. There you go. Can you see that? That's cool. Thanks. So it raises a question. Already we have patterns of migration. Already we know that people migrate when they need to secure their families and secure their livelihood. We have some questions. What could be coming in the future? And what could this mean for the United States, particularly since we have such a rich history of migration with Mexico? All right, now I'd like to take you to Africa. This is a picture of the Sahel Desert. The Sahel is in the western part of Africa. I don't know if any of you have visited. This is a school teacher and three generations of farmers. For you, Brian, I was in this schoolroom with Jared Banks, who is your colleague. The school teacher was translating for us. There was a dialect that we didn't speak, and the school teacher helped us understand what these three generations of farmers were talking about. And consequently, over here on the edge of that room, there were a bunch of little children playing. They were just looking at the foreigners, wondering what they were doing, giggling, and kind of not too weighed down by the cares that we were talking about. But this is what the middle-aged farmer said. And he referred to a son and his father who was there with him. He said, my grandfather and father provided abundantly. They were farmers and sometimes hunted in the forest. After the big drought, and here he and almost everybody that we talked to in the Sahel referred to these massive droughts of the 1970s and 1980s. You might remember there was a lot of famine and a lot of call for international help. People were starving to death because of these droughts. After the big drought, the trees died and the animals went away. I'm a farmer too, today, 2010, that's when we talked to him. But I have to go to the city to earn extra money to feed my family and our children, and then he pointed to these beautiful little kids playing over in the corner. And then he looked really serious and he said, none of the young people have a chance to farm. It's a mix of big dreams and too many problems with the weather. Life is too hard here, so they almost all try to go. Later in the week, we were talking with the mayor of another small village, and he told us he, in his small village, had lost 300 young men. They had all tried to migrate to Europe. Not one of them had returned, and they hadn't heard from any of them. And he fears that they may have died. People migrate, or they die trying, when they're in desperate conditions. Now, what we don't know is what happens in between. And I don't want to paint too bleak of a future. There are lots of opportunities, and that's where you come in as teachers. And that's where you come in to change your communities and change some of the things that could make a big difference to these people as well as to ourselves. So I don't want to just tell the sad story. There's also a lot of hope. This is a map of the area that I was just talking about. This is Western Africa, so you see this little curve of Africa, which you know so well. Some places might get rainier, and some places might get drier, and we as scientists are finding out a little bit about that. Now this is the end of our tour. I'd like to take you way out to the South Pacific. This is one of the main islands of an atoll island country. I don't know if any of you are geography teachers, but this is built on the remains or the skeleton of an ancient volcanic system. This is Tuvalu. And this is a really small map. It's a very small area. Michael actually was there, so Michael knows. If you see that line right there, that's the airport. And what you see here are, again, those little squares that you see, those are projections of sea level rise. And of course, they're not exactly contoured to the coast because it's hard to do this kind of modeling. So we projected what sea level rise might mean for this island. Parts of the island are covered, and there are maybe about 300 households living on the opposite side. I was at the climate negotiations 2 weeks ago talking with the 5 delegates from Tuvalu, and they looked at this map and said, actually, you've got it all wrong. That's not how flooding happens in our island. In our island, because we're built on a coral reef, the flooding comes from inside the island. And he said, what happens when, what he says is, this area is the area that's flooded. What happens is the sea comes from inside the island because it's porous, and it comes inside and floods everything. It floods literally from the inside out. And so this map, I just found out 2 weeks ago. Sorry, I haven't updated it yet. But what you see is that sea level rise has a much more significant potential effect on human societies out there in the Pacific than we even thought a couple of years ago. And these people are looking for some help. And we have it in our power to help them and also to help ourselves. One last thing, closer to home. There is a group of very serious scientists. They're not very much fun, but they're really good at what they do. They're sitting in Norway. I don't know if you've ever talked with somebody from Finland or Norway, but if it's winter, they don't have a lot of words. And it's kind of, you have to really pull every word out of them. Lovely people, of course. But this Arctic monitoring and assessment program has been keeping an eye on Greenland, where we have a massive, I think a mile, it's 2 kilometers deep, so that's maybe a mile, a little bit more than a mile deep of ice, massive frozen fresh water sitting on top of Greenland, and we're concerned about it. So they've been looking at this, and they released their report about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and these are some of the key findings. Again, going back to climate change, we're concerned that as global temperatures rise, ice melts when it gets warmer. So they said that the Arctic temperatures in the past 6 years were the highest since measurements began way back in 1880. This report also said that the melting of Arctic glaciers and ice caps, including this huge glacier sitting on top of Greenland, are projected to help raise global sea level by 35 to 63 inches. We used to think, just a few years ago, it was 7 to 21 inches, so between that and that. We used to think that's what sea level rise would look like in the 21st century, and now it's getting up to my forehead. That starts raising some questions close to home. Boston, Washington, D.C., New York, San Diego, Florida, big parts of Florida are not very high in elevation. So it starts raising questions. Wow, this could affect us too. It's not just people out there far away in the South Pacific. What are we going to do about this? Well, there are some things to do. I'm so sorry about it. I made a typo, and I know you're not European leaders. Beg your pardon about that. But there are 5 things that we can do, that you can do with your classrooms, and that your class members or your students can help do with U.S. leadership. First of all, we need to support good science. I think there's a big debate whether or not climate change is real. 97% of climate scientists feel very confident that climate change is real. And nevertheless, there's a big debate going on, at least in the United States, about climate change. Is it real, first of all? Are people causing it? The interesting thing there is if people aren't causing it, then we don't have to do anything about it. So that's a debate. But maybe you could explore that kind of thing with your students. For me, I'm on the end, of course, I work with the IPCC, which has this big report that came out in 2007. You remember it won the Nobel Peace Prize. And then our next report is coming out in 2014. So you can talk to your students about that. And you can talk about science and what it means for decision making. But one thing we can do, and one thing that you can address straight on is, if there's a debate about the science, what do? Do you not believe the science, or do you try and get better science? And I'm a scientist, so it's not very surprising that I would say, well, let's try and do better science, and let's talk about it. Let's not just say, okay, well, we don't have to worry about that. Do good science, ask good questions, encourage and inspire your students to get involved and to ask good questions. Number 2 is actually the most important of anything. And this is quite interesting because whether or not it's climate change or environmental change, we know that our world is changing and we need to change with it. And there are lots and lots of opportunities. Now I could go on for another hour, which I won't, Jamie, about what climate science says, but we have a window of opportunity which is now. And that window of opportunity will close before your students go to college. That's 5 years, maybe 10. And then we will be locked into a world where our oceans, which are huge and wonderful and teeming with life, but because they're so huge, they don't change very quickly. Right now, oceans are acidifying. That means that oceans absorb carbon dioxide and other kinds of things that we're putting into the air. They absorb those, and that's good. They're like a filter, and they're our lungs. The phytoplankton that live in the oceans created life on Earth in some ways. They created this air around us. They created everything. But they don't like it when water gets warm. And that's what the oceans are doing. They're warming. And they're also expanding. So that doesn't change very quickly. Our energy systems, it takes a lot of time and a lot of money to build new energy systems. So again, that's why we have this 5 to 10 year period when we can change, and it's our battle to fight. We need to do it now, however. So it's not tomorrow that we need to change, but it might be next year. So what we need to do in the meantime, whether or not you believe in climate change, is we need to provide ourselves and all of our neighbors and brothers and sisters on this planet options. People need options and choices. We know that people, when they can't live, when they can't make it anymore in their homes, often they have to leave. But we don't want it to get to that point. So let's think about adaptation options, where people live, because everybody wants to stay at home. You might want to go out and see the world, but you definitely plan on coming back home. So let's find ways to multiply those adaptation options so that people can stay at home. Third, we have already a world of migrants. And there are vast numbers of migrants that live among us. I'm a migrant to Europe, for example, but I'm from the United States. There are lots and lots of people that live in Chicago that aren't from Chicago. They're from all over the world. Those are the diaspora. And we can get some good ideas by talking to them. If you teach social studies and talk about integration, this might be a kind of entry point. How do you talk to your neighbors? How do you find out about where they're from and the challenges that they face at home? And how together can you find solutions? Number 3, talking to the diaspora is pretty much an unexplored kind of treasure trove of information and potential. Number 4, We can promote disaster risk reduction and conflict mediation. All over the world, at home and in foreign countries, we have natural disasters. And a lot of these disasters, although you can't avoid nature's impacts, you can still do a lot about it. For example, a lot of countries have flooding because people throw trash into the canals. And the canals get blocked, and then when it rains, even a medium rain, you get flooding. I've seen this in Honduras and Nicaragua, all over. Plastic bottles are kind of clogging up the irrigation canals and the drainage systems. There are lots and lots of practical things that we could do, and I think the State Department and a lot of other organizations are involved in disaster risk reduction, so there's a lot that we could do there. And then fifth, start thinking. Talk with your students. What kinds of guiding principles could we think about to help us provide or think about the future? What kinds of guiding principles and policies would we need to transition into our future? Now, this is really important because we are changing. We're going to have more people than ever. We're going to hit 7 billion in October of this year. By the way, there's a wonderful resource. The National Geographic this year has a series of articles called The World at 7 Billion Plus. There are all sorts of really, really good articles in there about the environment, about society, about cities. This is a wonderful resource. But you can talk to your students. How do we transition peacefully? There are a lot of scholars which think that people fight when there are fewer resources. And we're definitely headed into a world where there will be fewer finite resources spread across a lot of different people. How do we get to that future peacefully and prosperously? So those are just a few ideas. And this brings me then to my final conclusion. We stand today over on this side of the room, and we have a lot to learn, but we know our world today. And then we raise our eyes and look out to the future. And there are lots of questions. And your job as teachers is to prepare your students to prosper and live in their future, and to prepare them to lead us into the future. It's about us, it's about them and their children and our children. It's about a peaceful, stable future. It's really important. We know a little bit today. There's a lot that we don't know about the future. And it's your job to help us fill in the gaps. And you as educators are the best situated. There's nobody who touches the lives of individual students like you do. And so I'd like to offer you, if I can help you, I didn't bring any handouts, but if I can support you with anything, I'll give you my email and I'll help you. If you need facts, I'm not a teacher like you are, so I don't have such great ideas about worksheets and good ways to work with students, but I'll commit to help you in any way that I can to help you do your job. And this is maybe the last quote, and this is why it's so important. The decisions that we make today in the United States is really important, partly because we're really big and really rich and we use a lot of energy. So just because we're such a mammoth, we're important. Maybe in a bad way, but really, really important. And the decisions that we make today, 60 votes, Michael, maybe you'll talk about that. We just need 60 votes to get some of the most important historical decisions through that will determine our future. And it's to us. These decisions will determine whether migration is a matter of choice and voluntary seeking the better life, or whether it's just trying to get to a place where we can survive. Literally as individual migrants and their families, and metaphorically for us as the human race. It's really important that we make the right decisions and that we do so in a timely way, because the change is coming. It's our decision which pathway we go. We can choose our future. I'd like to leave you with those thoughts. This is my address and my email address if I can help you with anything. It's been a really big privilege to be with you today, and let me know if I can help you in any way. Thank you very much. We have all sorts of publications on this topic. I put a few out here. I didn't bring enough for everybody in the room, partially because I wasn't sure if you'd be interested. But we have a lot of reports. some with facts. For example, these maps and these quotes are all put together in a summary for policymakers. That report is called In Search of Shelter. And if you want that, I can provide it to you digitally. I also gave it to Jamie, and she was mentioning that it's on your website, Jamie. So you can already download that and a bunch of other reports. What we don't have is really good, concise worksheets that you might develop with your students, but I can maybe support you with some facts and figures if you want to develop such a thing for like a module for your class. I have to say, though, I've also done this at my son's kindergarten, which is odd. So you've got these little kids from 3 to 6 years old, and I didn't do the full meal deal that I almost presented to you today. But little children get it, and what we did then is, this is just, actually, should I stop? Because I'm going over time. All right, well, just for an example, what we did with little children, so if you're a grade school teacher, I started by asking the children, where are you from? And then I asked them to draw a picture of where they're from, and a lot of them drew pictures of their houses. And then we kind of broadened it out, and I asked them to kind of think of animals, for example, because little children, this might be way under your level, but little children think a lot about animals. They're interested. And then we also talked that animals need a home. Everybody needs a home. And we talked, the next step was about how we can take care of our environment so that everybody can keep their home. And then, you can just build on some really, really simple ideas with that. That was for a kindergarten class. And for elementary school, junior high, and high school, you can, of course, get increasingly sophisticated for what's age appropriate. Sure. So what's your name, sir? Jay Mulberry from?
Just a retired high school principal with an interest in the subject.
Excellent. So Jay Mulberry, a former high school principal, asked the question about, is it U.S. leadership or is it world leadership? In the U.S., he noted that it's having big changes in our energy systems in the next 5 to 10 years looks politically difficult. And so what's the status in the rest of the world? As I mentioned before, part of my job is to work in the international climate negotiations. So we just concluded a meeting in Bonn, Germany. That we're having tons of meetings all the time, of course, because we're United Nations. We meet and talk. And there we notice similarly, kind of worldwide, there's this big dilemma. We know we need to change. The argument has been laid that transitioning into a whole bunch of different energy forms, probably our traditional energy forms right now that our industrialized societies are based on, they're carbon-based, and those probably are going to be around for a while, but there's the idea and this pressing need to find new energy forms, partly because we need energy, we're growing, economic growth is based on affordable, stable energy. And partly because we have this massive and growing issue with climate change. So, yeah, the United States, we're right before a presidential election. It's not a time when politicians might feel that they can make big commitments. You would know that better than I am because you're exposed to US media all around, like every hour of the day. So we're not expecting really big changes in the US. What about Europe? Could Europe provide some leadership? Well, Europe is now having leadership by Poland. I think it started yesterday. And Poland's economy is largely fueled by coal. So the Polish government isn't very excited about making big shifts in their energy system. So Europe might be waiting for a little bit. We look around the globe to Australia and to other big industrialized countries, and we're seeing similar kind of political questions where we know we need to change, we're not quite ready to make that change, and all of the electorates, we're all affected, for sure. It's your taxpayer money that would probably be needed to invest in big new energy systems. I pay taxes, you all pay taxes, and of course, we're concerned about how public money is spent. So right now we have these trade-offs, and they're really hard decisions, and we're not seeing a huge amount of shifts. But there are changes happening, and we're just not sure about how quickly those changes are going to happen. As I said, I live in Germany, and Germans have had 30 years or so of a kind of atomic energy movement, and that's very particular to Germany and kind of their historical context. But the earthquakes in Japan this spring have caused a complete shift in Germany's energy policy. Germany decided to close down all of their atomic energy plants. And again, I'm not criticizing atomic energy. I know that that's used all over the world. But for Germany, this is changing the political context, in that Germany has said, okay, we're going to shut down our atomic energy plants. Our people have democratically expressed their opinion. That's not the energy form that they want. So they said, okay, we're going to give ourselves 8 to 10 years, and then we're off atomic. But that creates a gap of 15 to 20%. Where is that energy? Where are those energy needs going to be filled? And for Germany, right now they're in the process of transitioning towards wind and other kinds of renewables. That's pretty interesting. Could that be a kind of energy shift? It's just one country, but it might provide a vision for other countries that it's possible to make a transition in energy systems. For a long time, we're going to need a mix of energy. We're going to need to become much more efficient, and we will need new energy forms, hopefully sustainable, renewable. China is making a shift. China, of course, is growing in their economic power, but China wants to own the energy future, and they're already powerful. And some analysts say that if China owns the renewable energy future, their place in world economic power will be solidified. So there are some shifts. It's pretty slow. We have a 5 to 10 year window, and there are lots of questions. It's really exciting, and it's almost like, what do you call those novels where, like, the climax comes and you think, oh no, it's gonna crash, there's no way, and then right in the in the nick of time, then the hero comes through and saves the day. I don't know if it will be like that, but there are some shifts that are happening. So it's not all doom and gloom, but we have a lot of work to do. Yeah, this issue about global warming, the way, and again, this is why you as teachers play such an important role. The words that we use shape our perception. And so a long time ago, some scientists came. We have such a hard time. Science, we're really klutzy a lot of times in communicating our ideas. But there was an idea of the greenhouse, and we have this wonderful atmosphere which shields the earth. It keeps the warmth inside, that's our global atmosphere, and it makes life possible. Now CO2 acts like a blanket. CO2 is carbon dioxide, and it acts like a blanket. It's not only CO2, by the way, there's kind of a mix of things that we're putting into the atmosphere, but it acts like a blanket, it keeps heat in, and that is global warming. So we called it, hey, it's a greenhouse gas effect and it's global warming. And scientists were all getting it. They're like, yeah, I totally understand what you mean. The public, in the meantime, understands climate really differently. We all watch the news, and we understand weather as something that happens today, and climate as what's normal in our region at different seasons of the year. And so where I'm from, for example, Utah, a very red state, and most of my friends are climate skeptics. I can't even talk to them about what I do because they laugh at me. Or they say, are you serious? You're such a nice girl. What are you doing in this? And they really don't get it. So this last winter, for example, really, really heavy snows in Utah. We're still skiing in Utah. There's 10 feet of snow at Alta and Snowbird, so I'd recommend get out there because it is the best snow on earth. But they're saying, it was actually a really cold winter, so what's this with warming? It's not warm, it's cold. So there's no such thing as global warming, and that kind of, the terms that we use play a really important role. We do use the term climate change, and that might give us a more nuanced idea that the climate is changing. Things are happening in ways that we just weren't expecting. Going back to my presentation, all over the world, we talk mostly with farmers and migrants, and they say, we have traditional almanacs, and farmers know weather. If there's one thing that farmers know, it's weather. They know what weeks to plant. They know I have a 3-week period in February when the rains come, like in Eastern Africa. And they have to plant their seeds when the rains come. And they're really poor farmers, so their seeds are like your savings. It's all that they've got. And they have to make sure that they plant at the right time. If they don't, they lose everything. And then they don't have any seeds, and then they have to kill their animals and send their children off to who knows what to try and earn money. And those people have been saying, you know, the seasons are changing by up to 8 weeks. For example, in Ethiopia, I was doing field work in March, and we were talking to farmers there, and there are 2 rainy seasons in Eastern Africa, and the short rains, so-called short rains, hadn't come. They were 6 weeks late. And then for all of us who aren't farmers would say, okay, well, no problem. Let's just wait till the rains come, and when they come, put your seeds in the ground. But for the farmers, it's much more nuanced. The farmers need both planting seasons to plant enough food to feed their families. And for them, they get 20%, 1 out of 5 days in the week, well, a work day anyway. The food that they eat on that one work day comes from this short rainy season. And the other 4 days of the working week, they get their food from the long rainy seasons. And the short rainy seasons didn't come. And so were they going to plant? Well, I would have said, yeah, well, when the rains come, then you plant. You just wait a little bit. That's no problem. But they said, you know what? We've lost an entire season. Because our fields have to be cleared, we're not going to plant now. It's a month before the big rains come. There's no way we're going to plant now, because if we plant, we won't have an end. If something grows, we won't have enough time to harvest and clear our fields and prepare the fields for the big rainy season. And so these changes in the weather have really significant impacts, especially on poor people. But even last year, there was, I don't know if you noticed, but there was a big spike in the price of corn, wheat, cotton. Why? There were several hot days in the United States. One hot day can reduce crop yields significantly, enough to make you feel it in your checkbook. So the price of meat was expensive last year because a lot of the meat in the United States is corn-fed. The price of all sorts of things that use rice, wheat, and other cotton was a lot more expensive last year because of hot days. Hot days reduce crop yields. Grain, the grains that we have today, grow in a comfortable about 3 degrees Celsius bandwidth. When temperatures go above that, they tend not to germinate, meaning they don't produce grain. So these kinds of changes in the climate, and global warming came because we're looking at global increases in temperatures, but changes in the climate affect our day-to-day lives in how much food costs, and whether water is available, all sorts of things like that. So Jamie was just asking the question about whether or not our understanding is based on, of temperature changes kind of stops at the border. There are a couple of answers to that. We collect information about the weather through weather stations, and you've got all sorts of different kinds, but one of the reliable kinds of data that we collect is through a synoptic weather station, and these are often located at airports. And in a country like the United States, we have lots of infrastructure, lots of airports, and a lot of weather stations. In developing countries, most developing countries have an airport, and so they have this nice weather collecting system, but it doesn't reflect everywhere. You get data about your weather where your weather station is. So what happens is we tend to have better weather data in cities and in areas where there's a lot of built infrastructure along major roads and things like that, and less, this is just a general statement, but we tend to have less good weather data out in the countryside. Now what's interesting is that we also report on our weather data based on political borders. Satellite imagery, if any of you do geography, this is such a cool technology. Earth observation systems are unlocking all kinds of new insights about climate change, about land use patterns, and all of those kinds of things. And this kind of technology, if you show a map to your students, and some of the maps that I've shown you, for example, I'll just shift back if I can. I'll shift back to Mexico, assuming that we all knew Mexico a little bit better. So. These satellite images, you again see these square areas. That's because we take pictures of the Earth in squares and then pixelate. And that's also not my field, so for those of you who know it, you could probably talk a lot more eloquently. But we get an idea of what things look like from above. And these kinds of satellite images give us a much better idea of how things are happening in a system, not just stopping at our US border, for example. So Jamie, I partially answered your question. I did want to just add that in industrialized countries, we're already noticing, for example, in Germany, a friend of mine is a meteorologist, and he said already he's noticed a long-term trend of plus 2 degrees Celsius. And a lot of countries in Europe, I'm not sure about the United States, I just don't know the Met services here quite as well, but a lot of countries are already reporting plus 2 degrees in min and max. So minimum temperatures, nighttime temperatures, for example, and max daytime temperatures since about the 1980s. And that's, now a 30-year trend. So we already see in some places that we're already at 2 degrees in some ways. This is an excellent point. When you're talking with your students, I'm not a teacher, so I shouldn't tell you because you know much better than me, but I think it's really important to give, and this comes also back to your comment, give your students tools to think critically about the data that we have. Also give them the right words to talk about it. You can make your students articulate, so give them ideas about good questions to ask. Exactly we have in cities, we have heat islands where you have an asphalt surface, for example, it's going to be a lot more hot than if you were recording data out in the middle of a cornfield or something. This is a really, really good point. It's important to point out the skeptics as well as the kind of climate activists so that students can think actively about it. And ultimately, they're going to come to their own decisions. And if they only get one side of the argument, their parents, for example, may have a totally different perspective, and they'll say, well, did you think about that? And if the students haven't been prepared by you, wise teachers, then all of your hard work might just kind of go out the window. They need to hear both sides of the argument. So, for example, pointing out gaps in the data and important questions to ask, that's a really good suggestion. So the question is about how to tell individual stories and help students really connect with real people and understand systems. There are tons and tons of great resources. And maybe we could talk about it. I see Jamie standing, so I think my time is almost up. And I think the other gentleman also has a comment. But let me name just a couple of resources. If you want to have a book, there are several books that talk about families all over the world. There's a book put out by the National Geographic and one that was put out by the United Nations UNFPA. So I think it's UN Population Fund or something like that. They've put out books, and basically what they do is they show a real family, and from like 80 countries in the world, the family takes out all of their possessions, all of their earthly possessions, and puts them out in their front yard or whatever they call their yard. And then a photographer takes a picture and does some interviews. What do they eat? Do the kids get to go to school? What does a typical child look like? What are their concerns and how do they live? And these are really, really neat. Every time that I do field work, I get out that book from my shelf and I look at it with my little boy just so he knows where I'm going to go and what it's like for kids. And it's really, really good. Material World, you know it. Material World by Peter Menzel and his wife. This is just one of 100,000 great resources. There are lots of projects worldwide, community projects as well as development projects. You might think of contacting the State Department or looking at the State Department or USAID's website to find out about development projects if you were going to link up and do a pen pal exchange or something like that. But there's really a lot going on and lots of ways to help your students understand they live in a system rather than it's not just them. That's also a way to help students feel more connected with their world. Also, something you might think about is if you want to help students just understand their local environments, you might invite in a local ranger or somebody from the water treatment plant. You might think about, I'm just kind of brainstorming here, these are things that I did with my boy in his kindergarten. You might take a field trip to the local watershed or to the local water treatment plant. That's just one example because you mentioned water. There are lots and lots of things that you can do to help your students realize they live in a system that's bigger than themselves, but that their actions make a difference. That the way that they act and their behavior and their decisions with their families really make a difference. Maybe I can just end. Michael Nash's film is one of the best documentaries that puts a face on climate change. And he's a wonderful resource, and he's sitting right here. He's been all over the world talking to real people, and probably you have some ideas too, Michael.